Dark, edgy, gritty, realistic. These terms are often thrown around when describing a movie or TV show remake shot 50 shades darker than the original. And the idea of the darker, edgier, grittier, or realistic-ier reboot originated from Batman Begins. Think about it, darker reboots and darker superhero stories in general weren't as mainstream before Batman Begins. A lot of movies were influenced by that film, for better and for worse. Batman Begins was inspiring to these filmmakers for how it took such an iconic and beloved world and character and made them look like they came from our world. It was so influential that superhero stories to this day are still emulating Batman Begins to imitate it, be the opposite to stand out from it, or a little bit of both. And while Batman Begins itself had some issues we'll get into later, it was the spark that started the beautiful, blazing fire that is the Dark Knight, which sizzled into a sort of burnt but pretty satisfying simmer of the Dark Knight Rises that concluded the prestigious Dark Knight Trilogy, a film trilogy whose practices and influences can still be seen to this day. Except for the title of the movie only appearing at the end of the movie, that kind of died out in the early 2010s. The Dark Knight Trilogy is such an influential piece of pop culture that it changed the landscape of superhero movies, TV shows, and other types of adaptations in media by deconstructing the status quo of its source material. In case you didn't know, Batman has been around for a really long time. He's been around since the 30s, and his status quo shifted a lot since his creation. So let's talk about his journey from idea to Batman Begins. The idea of Batman was created in 1939 when Bob Kane was tasked by the National Comics publication, later known as DC Comics, to make a superhero as popular as their flagship creation, Superman. Now, the reason why I said Bob Kane only created the idea of Batman is because his collaborator, Bill Finger, came up with everything we associate with Batman as a character. His iconic costume, his secret identity, most of his rogue gallery and allies, and Gotham City itself were all created by Finger. Bill Finger is the true mastermind behind the Batman and the reason why he's so iconic. And he's gotten very little credit until recent years. There's a very interesting documentary talking about Finger's relationship with Batman called Batman and Bill that I highly recommend if you don't know who Bill Finger is. But I'm getting way off topic. Fuck Bob Kane. Batman was already breaking superhero conventions by looking more like a villain to scare his victims rather than looking heroic for the public. Batman's characterization took some inspiration from classic characters like the Scarlet Pimpernel and Zorro, characters who did good deeds in secret while playing a billionaire playboy persona to not draw suspicion. And his earlier comic book stories were inspired by some Pulp Fiction comic strips, including Doc Savage, The Shadow, Dick Tracy, and Sherlock Holmes. His first stories were also relatively darker to match that Pulp Fiction tone, with Batman not showing remorse for killing or torturing criminals. Over the years, he got a little softer to appeal to wider audiences, like the introduction of Robin and adapting his iconic no-killing role. His status quo continued to shift with the release of the iconic 1966 live-action Batman TV show, which took a more campy, lighthearted approach to his storytelling in contrast to Batman's more dark-hearted comic book adventures. The show was a huge success, and it was very popular amongst general audiences. But because of the show's popularity, most people thought of Batman as a silly, campy superhero, disregarding the comics since most people don't read them, including me. Most of my comic book knowledge comes from Wikipedia and other YouTube videos. General perception of the Caped Crusader would change once again with the release of the equally iconic Tim Burton Batman movie. Batman '88 brought the hero back to his darker roots while maintaining some of the campiness from his older TV brother. And it was a beautiful blend of the two styles, creating a truly unique film that helped shape the direction for most modern superhero movies. And because of that movie's success, we got a truly special piece of art inspired by Batman '88 style. The classic Bruce Timm Batman the Animated Series was, and still is, a masterpiece. A masterclass in both visuals and storytelling that successfully combined everything everyone loved about the Dark Avenger while also being wholly unique. It's responsible for so many storylines and elements we associate with Batman's history, including changing Dr. Freeze's origin story and the introduction of the iconic Harley Quinn. Batman the Animated Series was the peak of Batman's mythos and is generally regarded as the definitive Batman adaptation to this day. But no one at the time cared, because cartoons are for kids, and the live-action films released alongside the animated series weren't doing very well. Particularly, the infamous Batman and Robin killed the public's perception of Batman being a high-quality franchise. Batman fatigue was definitely prevalent during this time period, and it would be years before we got to see another proper theatrical Batman film. Between that time, multiple film directors came to Warner Bros. To pitch their own reboots before the studio ultimately chose the vision of then unknown film director
Christopher Nolan. Nolan's vision was to tell a story that was, shocker, darker and realistic, but also a personal one for both Batman and Bruce Wayne. And this story tells a version of Batman's origins that have yet to be seen by mainstream audiences, in an effort to make people care more about the man underneath the mask. The movie that would eventually become Batman Begins was a huge risk for Warner Bros., as the critical and commercial failure of Batman and Robin didn't bode much confidence to the public. But as Batman Begins was released and word of mouth came out on how good the film was, public perception became more positive, leading to Batman Begins becoming another hit for the dynamic duo. Minus one. Robin never really appeared in these movies. I mean, he kind of does, but not really. After rewatching Batman Begins, I can definitely see why it was so popular. This was the first time anyone's taken a superhero this seriously. Gotham City is seen as a real living, breathing city in need of a vigilante. Depictions of Gotham in other media showcase how dark and shady it was, but it always had this comic booky feel to it. Begins makes criminals feel realistic by having a corrupt law system explain why crime is so prominent. The corrupt system isn't as explored here as it is in later Batman stories, but this is the first time we see a grimy and sleazy Gotham as opposed to just a dark one. Wait a minute, is that Trump? And that's the thing this movie excels at. It doesn't just make already established Batman lore darker and realistic, its world and story becomes darker and realistic because it deconstructs already established Batman lore. Take Batman, for example. Batman's purpose has always been becoming a one-man army against crime. Batman Begins not only explores how Bruce becomes that army, but the main villains explore how harmful Bruce's motivations and methods could be when in the wrong hands. The two main antagonists of this movie are Ra's al Ghul and the Scarecrow. Ra's al Ghul and his League of Shadows are a shadow representation of Bruce's motivations. Their goals are to reform corrupt civilizations by any means necessary, including just flat out destroying them. Apparently, they're the reason for the fall of Rome, which I imagine wasn't easy to pull off, so the LFS ain't messing around. And Scarecrow represents a mirrored version of Batman's motivations, which is fear and intimidation. Where Batman uses fear and intimidation to reform his victims, Scarecrow only uses it for personal gain. Stories where the villain and the hero have similar wants but different executions are interesting because they challenge the morality of the hero's ideals. This movie doesn't go as in depth with its themes as its sequel does, but the fact that it tells a Batman story where Batman faces people like him was probably very interesting to see for the first time. But this movie is definitely more bare bones compared to other Batman stories after it, and I think its biggest flaw is that it was trying to be both an origin story and a traditional Batman story. It led to some messy pacing in the beginning of the film and some not ideal writing towards the end. The editing is also kind of bad in some spots. There's some awkwardly executed scenes.
Come here. There you go.
Who touches a kid like that? I mean, it's kind of sweet, but who touches a kid like that? That's weird.
And Rachel is just really annoying.
All these years I wanted to kill him. Now I can't.
But this was definitely the blueprint for what a good reboot looks like. And Batman Begins has been said to be a lot of filmmakers' direct motivations of making their own reboots. And the most influential film Batman Begins affected is his way more popular younger brother, The Dark Knight. I don't think there ever has been or will be a perfect movie. Empire Strikes Back, Whiplash, Toy Story 2, Into the Spider-Verse, Pulp Fiction, The Velocipaster. These are all near perfect films, and The Dark Knight's definitely up there. This movie is so good, but you already knew that. This movie exploded when it came out. No one can stop talking about how fantastic The Dark Knight was. Everything about it was so iconic. The story, the characters, the action scenes, the memes, all of it was just effortlessly executed. And it's no secret that this is a lot of people's favorite Batman movie and movie. The Dark Knight took the universe Batman Begins laid out and just went ham on it. If Batman Begins was just a deconstruction of Batman, The Dark Knight is a full-on demolishing of the character. This movie doesn't just question Batman's motivation and methods, it questions Batman's existence. Because if crime in the city gets so bad that a vigilante like Batman is needed, the system's failed and there's no point in Gotham trying to save itself anymore. A point brought to life thanks to this film's iconic interpretation of Batman's greatest foe, the Joker. From his conception, the Joker was made to be a foil to Batman, but in the sense that it was just the antithesis of him. Batman being a stoic good guy and the Joker being a flamboyant bad guy. Their relationship and dynamic has gotten more complex in other Batman stories, but the challenge for the Dark Knight's interpretation of the Clown Prince of Crime was to translate that relationship in the universe already established in Batman Begins. Batman Begins realistically established the need for Batman's vigilantism, so the Joker has to realistically challenge that need. The Joker is a super terrorist to Batman's superheroism, a repercussion of Batman's hubris. Batman's essentially turned himself into a symbol of hope for Gotham's future and fear for Gotham's past. Batman not only inspired fear in the hearts and minds of criminals, but also hope in the hearts and minds of other people wanting to follow Batman's footsteps. People who don't have the same morals as Batman. The Joker's plan is to expose Batman's hubris. He pushes Batman to his limits, killing off important people in Gotham until Batman turns himself in, playing 4D chess with Batman and his allies until he does. The Joker is a way more compelling villain than the ones that Batman Begins because he's kinda right. Vigilantism is illegal, no matter how heroic or well-intended Batman is. And the fact that he tries to be a symbol for justice opens the door for people to challenge that notion, a fact that Jim Gordon called out at the end of Batman Begins. Because what's the point in following the rules when the people enforcing them aren't? And while the Joker's goal to expose Batman didn't succeed, he does ultimately win. He shakes up the status quo of this world so much that it affects Gotham's future. He corrupted Harvey Dent, a district attorney who was supposed to bring Gotham back to the light the legal way. After seeing how bad the law system is, thanks to Joker exposing it, he becomes selfish and attacks the people who harmed him. And I can go on and on about how good this movie is, the cinematography, the symbolism, the memes, but this video is about the Dark Knight's impact. And this movie changed the direction of superhero films by changing the public's perception of them. They weren't just dumb summer blockbusters anymore. They had the power to truly say something in the medium of cinema. The Dark Knight sparked so many real-life discussions at the time, such as terrorism and escalation. And it did so while retaining that dumb summer blockbuster fun. I can honestly say that the MCU wouldn't have been as successful without the Dark Knight's existence. I'm not saying that they wouldn't have been successful at all, but without the Dark Knight's effect on superhero movies, the MCU would have had a slower start. Cause if it wasn't for the Dark Knight, we wouldn't have moments like this. Thanks, Batman! The Dark Knight was definitely the peak of this trilogy and the peak of DC's popularity. But while the next film was called The Dark Knight Rises, DC would definitely fall under the pressure of the Dark Knight's impact. Making a masterpiece can be a double-edged sword. Everything you make afterwards will be compared to what came before and potentially be seen as mediocre. And The Dark Knight really cut DC and Warner Bros. Deep. While it was a huge hit for DC and Warner Bros., it also tracked them into a corner. People wanted more movies like The Dark Knight, more movies that were darker and realistic. So Warner Bros. Had to accommodate, but the movies released afterwards were either mixed or complete duds. A sequel to The Dark Knight was inevitable, as it could be a return to form for DC and Warner Bros. And while The Dark Knight Rises was well received, cracks in its structure made it inferior to its predecessor and foreshadowed DC's future. But The Dark Knight Rises is still a fantastic movie and a great finale to the Dark Knight Trilogy. The point of this movie was to break Batman and the trilogy's major players down to their lowest points for them to triumphantly rise by the end of the film. Bruce Wayne starts off as a secluded shell of his former self with a company on the brink of bankruptcy, which is a first for Batman. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we've ever seen a poor Batman before. Money is literally his superpower. We've also never seen a fully unhinged Gotham City that's completely consumed by anarchy thanks to its main villain. Bane poses a threat that the Joker only alluded to. Bane's physicality and cunning made him a formidable foe for the Dark Knight and led to a lot of iconic moments in this film. But that's the thing, this movie has a lot of great ideas and moments, but its issues lie within the logical hurdles to reach those moments. Sure, it's cool to see Bane take over Gotham, but why do people believe the lunatic that literally bombed Gotham Stadium when he said Gordon lied about the goodwill of Harvey Dent? Sure, it's cool to see Bruce Wayne work hard to climb out of the prison similar to his training in Batman Begins, but how did he get from the middle of nowhere to Gotham City when all the entrances are closed off? Yeah, it's cool to see a badass, comic-accurate version of Catwoman team up with Batman, but why is Batman so trusting of her after she betrayed him? Twice. Now, none of these plot holes that have been brought up to death at this point ruin the overall flow of this movie. And again, this movie is fantastic. There's a great video by a YouTube channel called Film Speak that goes more in depth on why this movie is so great. But these plot holes and logical hurdles being present foreshadows the fate of the more infamous movies that followed The Dark Knight Rises. Don't believe me? The co-writer for this movie and the trilogy, David S. Goyer, left halfway through writing this film to work on DC's next big superhero film, Man of Steel, which reputation speaks for itself.
I will find him. I will find him, Laura. I will find him!
Now, is that a stretch? I mean, Yeah, this is a video essay. These things jump to conclusions all the time. Like and subscribe. Man of Steel was an attempt to do to Superman what the Dark Knight Trilogy did to Batman. It tried to tell a darker Superman story with meaningful themes and deep symbolism, but instead of being deep or meaningful, it's shallow and nah. Pointless. People's biggest problem with Man of Steel is that it's too dark and they think you can't tell a darker Superman story since he's a lighter character. Well, I think you can make a darker Superman story that plays with his established tropes like the Dark Knight Trilogy did, just not like this. This movie's idea of making Superman realistic is to just make him an allegory for Jesus, and that's just, no. I mean, the idea itself isn't terrible, it's just poorly executed. Like, how are you gonna say he's pure and innocent like Jesus and then have him destroy someone's car after they pour beer in his face? And then they try to have a theme with Clark's fathers wanting different things from him, like Jor-El wanting him to be an example for humanity while Jonathan Kent wants him to hide his powers, but they end up ruining their character. Jor-El becomes this pretentious douche and Jonathan becomes a selfish idiot. All these problems have been pointed out and memed on by the internet over a decade ago, as well as concern over DC's budding cinematic universe. So DC and Warner Bros. Saw these criticisms, went back to the drawing board, and made two of the worst superhero movies of all time. And the reason why these movies were bad was because they were reactionary. They were trying to follow the trends that were popular without understanding why they weren't. Man of Steel tried to be deep like the Dark Knight Trilogy without the nuance of his writing. Batman vs Superman tried to be a darker version of the ever-growing MCU without its carefully crafted storytelling. Suicide Squad tried to be lighter to accommodate the negative reception of Batman vs Superman and ended up being a confuddled corporate mess. Wonder Woman and Justice League were better movies, the former being a breath of fresh air for the studio, but the latter being the remains of a frustrated Warner Bros. Tired of appealing to an audience they stopped respecting. The DCEU and DC in general has since picked up their broken pieces in recent years, but it took them a while to get to this point, and The Dark Knight is sort of responsible for this unfortunate timeline. But other studios who actually learned from the Dark Knight Trilogy took what worked about it and made it to their own. Marvel made most of their MCU films have lighter tones to contrast the Dark Knight Trilogy while still having compelling stories. Marvel movies outside the MCU like Logan and X-Men First Class took what worked in previous movies and refreshed those ideas for the stories they were telling. Even some non-superhero reboots like Rise of Planet of the Apes and Star Trek succeeded in becoming high-quality movies because they understood what in their properties needed to be updated and how to do it with a compelling narrative. And yeah, it's a little unfortunate that the Dark Knight Trilogy also contributed to the superhero fatigue we're experiencing now, but amazing projects inspired by the trilogy are still coming out. The Dark Knight Trilogy was an absolute staple in pop culture and the film industry. Everything about it has been dissected and analyzed to the sun and back, and will still be dissected and analyzed until the sun blows up. The trilogy may not have been perfect, but its timing was immaculate, and I hope it continues to inspire filmmakers in the future.
I say right foot creep.